Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Because we're finally, I think, done with the candidates, but we're still going to be talking about some issues relevant to the bencher election that's ongoing. And if you haven't voted yet, you still have another week to go. But given some of the technological problems there, I wouldn't leave it to the last minute, kind of like filing your annual reports there. So today we have Doug joining us. Doug, the chair of the FOLA there. And I guess, Doug, maybe first of all, thanks for doing it. And maybe you can give us a little overview of who you are.
Thanks for having me. And I've seen so many posts of these interviews, and I'm so delighted to be included in the lineup. My name is Doug Judson. I am the chair of the Federation of Ontario Law Associations. FOLA, as it's usually known, is the voice of Ontario's 46 county and district associations. So those are the associations generally of lawyers, though some of them have paralegal members now, across Ontario, or organized by a county and district system. So in Toronto, where JP is, the Toronto Lawyers Association is an affiliate member. I'm a member of the Rainy River District Law Association, where I'm based in northwestern Ontario, and I'm tonight in Fort Francis in my basement.
So, Doug, maybe you could tell us a little bit more. A lot maybe of my students, some and as well paralegals, because as you point out, there's not a wide range of paralegals involved in these associations. So, maybe kind of give us an overview of maybe the structure of FOLA and law associations generally, and how it all works.
Yeah, that's a great question. So law associations have grown across the province, sort of with the growth of Ontario itself and the expansion of the legal profession. So most of the associations grew around the courthouse libraries that were established when these judicial seats were set up in various counties and districts. So most counties or districts have at least one courthouse. Some have more than one courthouse. The main one usually has a county or district law library located in it. And the law associations were set up to sort of be representative organizations of the local legal community in those communities. And you have to appreciate that, back in the olden days when Ontario was still growing, it was still a new entity, a new province. There wasn't technology, there wasn't internet, there wasn't a way to get legal information from one location to another in a very fast way. So it was really important, in order to provide adequate legal services across the province, that we had this system of law libraries that grew alongside the profession. So that's the history. The Law Society Act in Ontario, which governs the Law Society of Ontario and gives the Law Society its self-regulatory powers, requires the treasurer, who is the head of the Law Society, to confer annually with the presidents of the county and district law associations. And it's from that tradition in law that FOLA was born. And we become sort of the forum for that engagement with the Law Society, but more generally, we've become an important stakeholder in consultations on policy development in the justice community, but also generally with the regulation of the profession and issues that arise with the courts and the Ministry of the Attorney General and other justice sector actors.
Yeah, so maybe you can touch on. I know there's a motion that's been put together there on I think it's on the 10th or the 25th when the convocation meets again. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that and sort of the kind of advocacy work FOLA does in conjunction with the Law Society through their convocations.
Thanks. Yeah, so FOLA does a lot of work to inform decision makers in the justice sector on the needs of county and district law associations and their members. And keep in mind, most of our members, especially outside of the larger centers, tend to be people who are doing sort of Main Street frontline legal services. They're your downtown, small city, small town lawyers in small to medium firms and sole practices. And so we tend to have very practical views on how issues impact the delivery of legal services in the province. One of the biggest issues that we're seeing right now in many parts of Ontario is what we call the graying of the bar, and that the bar is aging and there aren't new people coming in at the same rate that people are leaving practice in order to provide legal services in some of these communities. Now, when I raise that, a lot of people say, well, does that really matter? Do you really need to have new lawyers coming into, wherever your community is? when we have the internet, we have the ability to speak like we are tonight over Zoom. We can email things back and forth, and that solves part of the problem. Like in my own practice, I deal with clients across my region and across the province on a regular basis without issue. But there continues to be a need for people to be there in person to meet with clients, especially when we're dealing with clients who are marginalized, who are of a lower socioeconomic status, who have other barriers to accessing justice and don't have the ability to, have a cell phone, have reliable access to the internet, maybe are experiencing homelessness. The ability to have someone, especially in some of those legal aid practice areas like criminal defense and family law, to have someone in your community that hangs out their shingle where you can go knock on their door and get an appointment is really important. So all that to say, on May 10th, the Law Society is having its annual general meeting. And one thing that members of the Law Society can do is put forward motions to the annual meeting to be voted on. I believe the motions are non-binding, but they are important sort of politically within the profession to demonstrate support for issues. So what FOL has done is put a motion forward to the annual general meeting that calls on the Law Society to develop financial and non-financial incentives and strategies to help address the graying of the bar in some of these underserved communities and underserved areas of practice in those communities. And we've left the door open to what those solutions might be, but all to say we want the profession to start shining a light on this issue and doing more to support people that are entering practice or new lawyers to move to some of these communities and figure out ways to provide service in some of these areas where we're seeing the profession drying up a little bit.
Yeah, so perhaps you could expand a little bit there on some, maybe, I don't know if you've had those discussions, but again, you pointed out, obviously, we're talking over Zoom there, especially over from COVID, a lot of, let's say, Toronto area lawyers are able to reach, electronically some places, but you've pointed out some technological issues, or just some people prefer, obviously. It was just in Waterloo talking to a colleague yesterday, and they were saying, the Waterloo clients are like, oh, I can, you can bring in this Toronto lawyer, and they're like, oh, we don't want the Toronto lawyer, we want the lawyer from here that we can kind of go to their office.
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of, ideas maybe that have been sort of discussed? Obviously, ultimately, as you point out, leave it to the Law Society to look into this. But any thoughts there in trying to get people to areas like Fort Francis that historically, you're going to find a lot harder to convince students out of law school, hey, go and start your practice up north. And where people are preferring to sort of stay in the GTA or around larger cities. And as we found, that the articling crisis and even after that, right, setting up shop and getting hired, it tends to be problematic still now because there's just not enough jobs there in those areas.
Well, I think there's a lot of things we can look at. Some of them are within the domain of the Law Society. Some of them are within the domain of legal education. My own story, I think, reflects some of this. And I started at McCarthy Tatro in Toronto, wonderful firm, and I still have been in close contact with many of my colleagues there. My partner and I, who's also a partner in my firm, moved to Northwestern Ontario, where I'm from. We've been here for 5 years now. And I would say that, or 6 years, it's gone by that fast. And I'd say that, there's different opportunities for people starting practice in different parts of the province. And so part of it is we have to do a better sales job of telling people what quality of life they can have with their practice and the range of opportunities they will have to practice in different parts of the province. And I'm not saying you can only find that in Fort Francis. You can find it in all kinds of places, whether you're in Huron County or out in Eastern Ontario. There are lots of wonderful communities that will provide people and welcome them with open arms to set up shop and be part of their professional community. I think we need to work on that. And part of the challenge is that a lot of the early stages of our careers and our education really focuses on and tends to highlight the large employers, like the large government employers and the larger firms. And part of that's natural because they're very involved in legal education. They sponsor things. They tend to be sort of conglomerate around communities where there are law schools, and so that makes a difference, and it sort of penetrates your awareness a little bit more. But I think we could do a better job making these other opportunities available. To that extent, we've had some consultations the law society's already done that have really shone a light on the need to improve things like mentorship. My cat is joining me on the table behind me, and and he knows I can't do anything about it right now. But we can do more, I think, in the licensing pathway and the education pipeline that gets people into practice to give them opportunities and exposure to practicing in some of these environments. One example that I think has been a really great experiment, has continued to be successful, is the Lakehead University Law Program. So rather than have students article, they do placements during their final year of law school with a legal employer, and then at the end of that, they write the bar exam and they begin as a junior lawyer. We've had a placement student with our firm who's been absolutely wonderful, and because they've gained that experience through their legal education, there's more of a commitment to what work in our environment is like, and there's just more, I think, awareness of what their career prospects might look like in this type of practice, in this type of firm. So I think we need to sort of reinvent the pipeline we have to get into practice. We have to look at the sales job that we do to get to entice people to move to some of these centers. And then the last thing I'd say is the Law Society needs to start playing with some economic levers. Can we relieve a bit of the cost of the licensing programs? Can we relieve annual fees? Can we do things that just sweeten it a little bit if you practice in certain areas? Can we change licensing fees to reflect billable hours, the types of employer you're at? I know, some of my colleagues out there who work at community legal clinics have asked this question: is why am I paying the same annual fees to be a lawyer in this income or in this environment where I'm helping low income people to someone who, works at a large firm in the downtown of a major city? And I think those are all really valid questions when you look at the Law Society's statutory mandate, which requires that they facilitate access to justice for all people, for people across Ontario, which necessarily means everyone, wherever you live.
Yeah, so of course, talking about the Law Society again, as I said at the beginning, you never quite leave here the elections that are going on, and one of the big issues that I spoke to a number of candidates was surrounding law libraries, right? And certainly an issue that's probably very dear to you and all the FOLA and law associations. So perhaps maybe you can give us a little bit of a background of kind of where this came from and why it's been an issue in this election and previous to this election, and why the concern of potentially the impact this could have on the associations and then the law libraries themselves.
Yeah, so those libraries that we talked about earlier receive funding directly from the Law Society. Well, not directly through the Law Society, but from the Law Society. And how that funding, where it comes from, is that lawyers pay a portion of their annual licensing fee every year that goes towards a corporation called LEARN, the Legal Information Resource Network. And LEARN sets the policy and overarching sort of governance framework for Ontario's county and district law library system. LEARN gives grant funding from that pool of money to the different libraries that supports their operation. But ultimately, LEARN's budget comes from the levy that goes to lawyers through the Law Society's budget. And so Convocation holds the purse strings on how much is funded through LEARN back to the libraries. And that's what makes it a political issue in the profession, is that every year a budget proposal is put forward by LEARN for libraries for the things they want to do in accordance with their strategic plan and the mandate they've been given. And it requires that benchers approve that budget and impose that library levy. Sometimes it's called a competence levy on lawyers through their annual fees. So the reason it's a really hot potato right now is we've seen a number of efforts, particularly from the full stop incumbents and the full stop candidates, to cut down licensing fees. In the previous term, a number of blanket motions were attempted to cut licensing fees by an arbitrary two-digit percentage number, I think 10 and 25%. But there's been no guidance given in any of those motions where the cuts should come from, where you're going to find the savings. And so if I'm the Law Society staff, if I'm their CEO, and I have to go and find that money, I start looking at external cost centers and I start looking at libraries. And pretty soon that starts to cause pain for people and their clients especially in smaller communities in outlying areas where you really depend on having that law library in order to provide high quality, competent service to your clients. And so this is why it's such an important issue to lawyers in so many parts of the province, is that they can't practice without a library. They can't deliver cost-effective service without a library. And the library is a huge part of how they maintain their competency obligations to provide that service.
Now, I guess, I mean, from some others and brought up, well, is there other sources of funding for the law libraries or the law association? So again, maybe you have a little bit more background on how, besides the levy that goes through Learn, where else, do these, costs are taken care of? Whether there's membership dues in the local associations, do they have grants from other sources, perhaps? And I know, of course, the Law Foundation of Ontario, I keep hearing about getting the money from them instead. So Doug, maybe you can explain a little bit more of, whether that would be enough, and what, especially, with the transition to things being more virtual, that are there ways to kind of digitize stuff, and perhaps that might be, to address, in the event that there was less funding, what could be done?
So you're right. The other pool of funding that law associations receive is typically members pay a fee to be part of the association. So those dues also can contribute to the funding of the law association and the library. And certainly for large associations, that's not an insignificant amount of money. So those are sort of the two revenue generators, aside from maybe the odd paid professional development or CPD session that a library might offer. Sometimes they charge money to attend those because it supports the association, and there's costs associated with running those programs. So all of that does factor into the mix, but the Learn funding is very significant. It enables the library to do all of the things it does. Now, people will say, well, what do we need all these books for? Everything's online. That's true. But the other side of that is that the library provides access to those resources. So the suite of subscription services that you get access to as a county or district law association member right now that you can access through your library would cost you about $8,000 a year as a licensee if you were subscribing to them individually. You pay this $200 a year right now as part of your annual dues to get access to all of that incredible resource package. So there is value to the libraries in that not only do they provide the access to that at such a significant discount, but also they have staff there who help you use it, help you make understand how those databases work and how to make best use of those resources in your practice. So I don't know that we can ever pivot entirely away from having a physical footprint in our library system. But the other thing is that some of the things we talked about earlier, like the graying of the bar and the need to adapt and be creative and how our profession provides services in some of these communities, there may very well in the future be a larger role for libraries. Maybe libraries will have to have some element of public facing function in order to be financially sustainable and to justify their footprint in courthouses. So I think that there is an element of there's something about them that will always serve a purpose, and the purpose is, or maybe something that we haven't quite realized yet, but there is inherent value right now to having libraries because people simply couldn't practice without them in the way that we do.
Now, you brought up the I think the competency fund or the levy there, and perhaps now is a good time to talk about again on the paralegal venture side. There was questions about what is this levy, what is this FOLA survey, and who's FOLA. I mean, so all of these things that kind of came up, but you brought up of course that lawyers pay this $200 competency levy and gives them access to the law libraries. So maybe you can explain those two questions, because I know you had even put out a clarification blast about them. I mean, obviously part of editorializing the questions to be kind of more manageable to read from all the candidates and their responses, sometimes the context gets lost in there. So perhaps you can kind of look at those two questions and explain kind of where they're coming from and what this proposal would be, or I guess obviously the benchers would have to decide that one after election, but kind of what you were looking at in terms of those issues for paralegals.
Well, it's always a struggle, or it's a question mark, at least every year, as to what funding we're going to see for libraries come from convocation. And there's always a lot of lobbying that goes into it, a lot of communication with the benchers, a lot of consultation with Learn and the Law Society staff to make sure that we're seeing sufficient and sustainable funding for the libraries. Because it's not just the books, it's not just the stuff like that you see in the library. It's the staff, and making sure that we're appropriately compensating them for the skills that they bring to the important work that they do. The competency levy, because it is only charged to lawyers, it sort of limits the ceiling of how much funding you can derive for Learn to put through the organizations. So I think the suggestion in our survey was whether lawyer candidates would support having the paralegals also contribute to the competency levy. Right now, paralegals do not. And you'll see that in the Law Society's budget documents that line is zero for paralegals, because only lawyers contribute to the libraries. The rationale might be that if we're going into a belt tightening time where the Law Society, maybe under a future convocation, is looking to cut down its budget and find savings, it might be able to reduce annual fees if it's able to find another source of funding within the licensed professions. Now, obviously, this would require that associations, I think, also find ways to provide access to the library if another profession is funding them. But it's an open question. I think it's a policy issue that the Law Society is going to have to eventually take leadership on, and we'll have to see how associations respond to that. But it might be an opportunity to guarantee, at least in the medium term, that we have more sustainable ongoing funding for libraries.
And I mean, I guess in terms of maybe the results of those two related questions, I don't know if you have maybe like a general. I mean, we don't necessarily need to know candidate by candidate, but like kind of what the sort of pulse was on whether the paralegal should contribute, and I don't know what the follow up question was that was kind of related to that.
Well, the problem with the survey is that we offered too many questions that allowed lawyers to say it depends. And so it's I hesitate to say that the answers are leaning one way or another. I'll say there's a diversity of views, though, and I think that there was in the survey responses some fairly robust support for paralegals among lawyer candidates. So I'm optimistic that there will be a constructive conversation around these issues at some point under the next convocation, but we're gonna have to see who gets elected to that convocation first.
Yeah, before maybe we go into that and explore that a little bit, the other point then that's brought up, and I think I noticed it maybe in Peel, at the library there, where it's kind of for lawyers only, and that's sort of where I kind of clued in now, because that kind of makes a little bit more sense. That, well, if the paralegals aren't financially contributing through Learn, then some associations take a kind of hardline approach of it's lawyers only because lawyers paying for it, lawyer funding. I mean, I suppose that's the rationale, but I guess maybe on a broader level, right? I mean, in terms of law associations, I know the CCLA out in Carleton and I think very recently Middlesex, maybe a month ago, have allowed for paralegal membership in the organizations. Have you seen? I mean, am I missing anywhere else? And again, if we're looking at competencies and competence of licensees, I mean, paralegals are not like a different profession. Like if we're allowing access to the law libraries for, I don't know, like doctors or something, right? I mean, it's licensed by the Law Society. So, I mean, have you seen anything else in terms of a direction there? I mean, libraries being part of it, but of membership for paralegals in the associations, or even potentially at BOLA itself, right? For a paralegal representative.
Well, certainly, I'm supportive of paralegals being part of organizations, and I have one of the smallest law associations in the province. I think we have maybe 17 members, so very small compared to most of them. And I've actually approached my association some time ago and said, I don't want someone who is a paralegal and wants to become a member have to become, a guinea pig for this process as to whether we're going to let them in. I'd sooner we just be clear and upfront about whether we have paralegal members of our association. So if anyone has an issue with it, let me know. And that was 2 months ago. I sent an email and no one's objected to it. So I think that there's a lot more openness to the role of paralegals in our legal system than there was in years past. FOLA is the voice of its member associations, and we haven't really done a widespread official consultation on where people stand on this issue, and what there might be some practical limitations to it that I'm unaware of. But one thing I have encouraged the associations I've spoken to is that many of them are currently undergoing a process to make sure that their articles and bylaws of their corporations are compliant with the new Ontario Not-for-Profit Corporations Act. And they have to make that transition over a 3-year period that I think we're about halfway through right now. And so I've suggested to a lot of them, like, look, if you're going to do this work anyway, maybe you should start having this conversation about whether you're going to have different classes of membership or whether you're going to change the structure of your board. And I'm not telling anyone what to do. I'm not, trying to push that on anyone, but I think it's a conversation worth having. And if you're going to do the work anyway, to see if these articles and bylaws make sense for the type of organization and the legal community's needs today, maybe you should consider whether there's a role for paralegals in that structure in some way.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, you have those couple of examples, and I think again, I was up in Kitchener-Waterloo, and I think they were saying that they worked out. One of the instructors told me that they were working out getting this paralegal students access to some of the stuff in the I think it's a Waterloo Regional Law Association, if I'm not mistaken. But again, so to see more kind of collaboration between paralegals and lawyers, whether different associations, and then of course the libraries themselves. Because again, it comes back to, as you brought up, competence, or that the fact that these libraries also double as meeting hubs for CPDs, and if you're in the courthouse and you want to do a quick research, you can pop in there and you may run into colleagues, right? I mean, some of those other functions beyond just the library and the staff there.
Yeah, I think from my personal view is I think that we are at a time as a legal community, as professions, plural, right now, where it's a period of transformation. We went through a pandemic, and that was a catalyst for a lot of change. And I think there's been leadership on change from the courts. I think there's been leadership on change from court services. I think the Attorney General's ministry has led a lot of initiatives, and I think federally there's been a lot of change. Where I think we need to also be open to leading change and not just responding to it is in the bar. And so I think it's a good time right now. The climate is right. There's a lot of need to and a lot of incentive if we want to be, if we want to be core to the type of direction that our justice sector is moving, for leaders of the bar and of law associations to be engaged in these discussions about, what are the roles of these different professions and different players in a functioning legal system in my community, and how can we be part of that and highlight that and make sure the public is aware of that.
Now, Doug, with all this talk about governance and specifically the Law Society of Ontario governance, maybe before we kind of go in there and talk about the elections, we could kind of explain a little bit about how FOLA is set up. I mean, there's obviously the 46 associations. So I know you're the chair of FOLA right now, and I think you're not even into your actual term yet because of the previous chair getting appointed. But maybe you can kind of tell us how the structure is of FOLA, because it kind of will lead into what's going on there with the elections and the Law Society governance.
So FOLA is constituted by the 46 county and district associations. The TLA, which is the 47th, is an affiliate member. The TLA is the Toronto Lawyers Association. We are organized into the 7 judicial regions, just like the court. So Southwest, Central South, Central East, Central West, East, Northeast, and Northwest. And each of those regions, from each of those regions, the law presidents elect representatives to our board. So we have directors from each of those regions. And then we have, on top of that, we have executive members consisting of a second vice chair, a first vice chair, and a treasurer. And we have just 2 staff who do a tremendous amount of work to keep the organization going. So uh, and most of the formal proceedings of FOLA occur through our plenaries, which we currently have twice a year, one in the fall and one in the spring. And those are forums for us to provide resources and information to the presidents, and often we have many law librarians there as well. On issues that are germane to their professions and to work that's going on at the Law Society and the Ministry of the Attorney General and so forth. So that's in a nutshell how the organization is constituted. And because of that, it closely reflects the administration of the courts, which are organized by region, but also the representation that we have at the Law Society, at least among the lawyers, because the lawyer benchers are elected generally on a regionalized basis.
Right, so speaking of those elections that are ongoing, one of the things that came up in terms of the election, I mean, not just with FOLA, but in terms of different organizations that have offered endorsements and support of different groups, and certainly this election being very important. You have the different full stop, good governance, and then the unaffiliated candidates. So I know FOLA came out and endorsed some. I think some of their members and former members. And perhaps maybe you can kind of explain that. I mean, again, obviously you can't speak for the other organizations and how they go about their process, but sometimes again, you have all those associations. You probably have members on independent or unaffiliated candidates, maybe members of their local association, full stop members, good governance coalition members. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I know that was one of the questions that was asked as well. But how do you kind of manage all that when you have all this different support amongst your membership to make a decision to go in and say, we want to endorse this person? Because no matter what, even if you don't endorse anybody, you've kind of alienated part of that membership that says, no, why did you support these people? Why didn't you support these people? And how does that go in? Maybe you can kind of give us what you can share about that process.
Well, the trouble with endorsements is that when you're an endorser, you're not a surety. You can't just call the cops up when the person, doesn't do the things they were going to do after they get elected, right? So it's a little, it's always, I think, a little fraught when we have these discussions about, are we going to, say that this person or these group of people, these are the ones that we want to get in. FOLA is in a different position than most of the organizations that you've seen come out publicly with endorsements. One of the unique factors is that we are a federation of other organizations. And we know that there are people in many of those organizations that are running as independents or have ties to the different slate-based campaigns in the election. And so we wanted to be respectful of that. At the same time, our role is also to be the chief advocate for courthouse law libraries. And but one way we wanted to do that was by highlighting the positions of the candidates on those issues. And so we published a survey, and one of the main question areas is on law libraries. But the other way was highlighting people who've been part of our board, who've done the work. And they're not the only ones who've done it. Like, there's tons of people running who've been involved in different legal organizations who understand the importance of these issues. And our endorsement was very open about that. But it was the cleanest way for us to identify people that, it was an endorsement of our board, of former members of our board. We did not want to get into a place where FOLA was speaking for 46 other organizations that we had not consulted with directly on the question of endorsement. So we felt this was a good way for us to send that message and really, again, make it about the libraries, because that's our biggest concern. There are a number of great candidates running. And I've encouraged everyone who is a voter in this election to check out the survey responses we have online. I know it's a very long document, but there are, a couple pretty yes, no, easy questions there that you can maybe get a sense from. I'm not going to tell people how to vote. I will note that we received 100% response rate from the independents, 100% response rate from the Good Governance Coalition candidates, but only about half of the full stop candidates took time to respond, and a number of them outright refused to participate.
Now, Doug, I mean, the other thing that comes up, with elections is, you're the chair of FOLA, and certainly you may have your own personal views, whether it's around these issues, and then FOLA may have, again, the position that they're taking with respect to the I think it's 3 candidates, and then generally support, for those who are in favor of library funding. So how do you kind of reconcile this? Because sometimes, I mean, certainly you say something, and is it Doug talking? Is it Fola talking? Is it, the board talking? Is it, some of the associations talking? So how do you kind of, and especially now on social media where, you're quick to post something and tweet something out, and then people are saying, well, this is politicizing Fola. It's not fair. Why is Doug saying this? So how do you kind of deal with all this, especially, in a climate where, every word that comes out, everyone's quick to jump in terms of this election?
I guess, can I swear on this show? No. What I would say is this, like, our board had a discussion early on in the process because I knew that various members were getting contacted by people who were going to run, who were thinking about running, about asking for their support. And we decided, like, look, you're all leaders in the bar in your own right. If you want to go out and endorse people personally, take your own positions in the election, you should do that. Fola's communications for Fola will come out either as statements from the board, or they will come through our official channels through social media, or on our website. And so that's what we've done. And we've been true to that the whole time. Now, the questions about politicizing Fola, like, that's a lot of BS. Like, we're an organization that exists, like many associations, to do political advocacy around the issues that our constituency cares about. And for the most part, for the entire part, like, I'm just going to be frank about it. For the entire part, we have been fact-based in the things we put out. Like, early on in the campaign, there were a number of statements that were made about law libraries by particularly the Full Stop campaign. We issued a clarifying statement on those because the record did not reflect many of the things that were said. Likewise, there have continued to be, I think, a need for fact checking in this election on some of the history of the issues, in order to give people the straight goods on what's going on. It's really unfortunate that we are in a very hyper partisan election that isn't supposed to be. This is supposed to be an election that's about choosing governors for a regulator. It's not supposed to be an election that's, that is waged between partisan factions. And I'm not saying that to normalize some of the more extreme things that are coming out of the one camp. I'm saying it because the privilege of self-regulation boils down to our ability to do a good job of it and to be committed to those principles that are enshrined in the Law Society Act. And when we get away from that, like we've seen, I think that it compromises our ability to do that, and it threatens the right to self-regulate as professions.
Now, Doug, I mean, obviously the law libraries, which we've talked quite a bit about in terms of funding, they're being perhaps top of the list there for you. I know we've talked about the motion there on the May 10th that you'd like to bring about sort of drawing attention to underserved, the graying of the bar, as you pointed out, in these underserved and more remote rural communities. I mean, is there anything else there in terms of, the election? I mean, obviously, a lot of people have voted, apparently, judging by the internet outages or website outages there. But there's still another week to go. So for people that are wondering about, some of these issues, is there something that's being missed there that, from Fola's perspective that, that you want to see from the candidates, whether, in the survey or just generally that you've observed, in terms of, what would make the best for Fola and some of the things you'd like to advance over the next 4 years?
Well, I think the ideal outcome is that we end up with a convocation that provides good governance. And I'm not saying that as a pun. I'm saying that with 2 small G's. We want good governance of the profession. We want people that are going to engage in thoughtful leadership and exercise their fiduciary duties with a view to things that are coming down the tube, like some of the issues around the modernization of legal services and the role of paralegals, some of the issues around artificial intelligence and how that's going to impact the work of lawyers and access to justice. But right now, we have a convocation that is mired in petty disputes, political disputes that have been egged on for 4 years by people who are now running around campaigning as though they are the most apolitical people and only they can rescue our profession from the politics, from the woke left. It is complete malarkey. The idea that the profession doesn't have a duty to engage in efforts to promote principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion in some way. And we can debate about, what that looks like. It is completely asinine. And the fact that we see this supplemented by a campaign from the right to what appears to be an effort just to bring forward an initiative to starve the Law Society of resources so that it can't do any of this important work. I think the profession really needs to take stock of that moment and ask questions about what the true motivations of that campaign are and what the impacts will be on the public and consequently on the future of self-regulation. There is a ton of hypocrisy in this election. I think a lot of it's coming from the Full Stop campaign. And I'm speaking for those who want to criticize me as me personally right now on those issues. And we need to cut through that as a profession, because I think that this is really a test, and it's a test of how easy it is to overtake a thoughtful and learned profession with misinformation in an election. And if we don't pass that test, how is any other elected body supposed to survive?
Yeah, and I think certainly there's been things thrown out on both sides, right? About part of the political posturing, right? But I mean, it goes to as well, right? In terms of this election's different because I mean, in the past you would just have 40 people elected out of a group of 120, and they were largely running on their own, sort of saying, here are the ideas I have, and now, the outcome, I mean, or two possible outcomes, right, is you have either the Full Stop team getting elected in a large number, or you have the Good Governance team getting elected with a huge number, and in which case, both sides will say, well, now they have control of the Law Society, which again, a lot different than in the past, certainly 2015 and before, where you'd have just 53 people discussing issues of, well, how much funding should we be giving to the law libraries, as opposed to, well, we're not giving this funding, or we are, and it's pretty clear, kind of like based on the numbers of benches you have that are affiliated with one versus the other.
I think that people really need to head into this election strategically, and I know some people are going to bristle when I say that. They're gonna not like it. We have, there's a lot of great candidates that are running as independents. There are great candidates running with the Good Governance Coalition. There are people that have made various contributions to the profession running in all camps. The reality is that because we are now faced with a partisan election, if you are going to go out there and vote for an independent in a number of these races, it would be like voting for the Green Party in a number of races in a federal or provincial election, as to say it is ineffective at actually getting the outcome that you might desire. So I am encouraging candidates to take a look at your local landscape. So for example, in a lot of regions, there are independents that have a really good shot of winning that would be really wonderful benchers, and take a look at them because they're going to be elected based on the votes in their region. Now, when you're in Toronto and you're looking at those aggregate 13 outside Toronto seats, the non-regional seats, those people are going to be elected overall. And take a good look at the type of political environment we're in. Are those people going to come out on top? And are you actually just going to end up with the adverse result from what you want if you support them? Again, these are unpopular messages among a lot of people. And, and believe me, I agree that this is supposed to be a high-minded process to select governors. And I hate that it is a partisan exercise, but because it's been made this way, because it has been defiled in this way, we have to play this game until we get people in place who have pledged to reform it and make sure that we are in a better position going forward to elect individual candidates on their merits and their contributions to the profession.
Now, you brought up reform there. I know obviously you're not running for bencher, but I don't know if you've ever thought of, based on this election or based maybe on the previous one, is the way we pick our board. I mean, you've sort of laid out what the structure is, for FOLA, right? I mean, you have, again, 46, 47 associations, and it comes together and get representation amongst the regions by the courts. Is there a better process there for us picking our our benchers? I mean, do we need 53 of them? I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Doug. And again, probably speaking just as Doug, not necessarily as chair of
Well,
FOLA.
I think that everyone's going to have a different opinion on it, including me and probably, every single one of the law associations that are part of FOLA. So I'm going to get in trouble regardless of what I say. But I do think that we need to look at it again and think about, does this really make sense? Is this really an appropriate composition of this institution, given the current mix in the profession, the distribution of licensees across the province, given the need for reconciliation and gender balance and all of these other factors that have emerged. And I think also the profession has modernized and organized in ways that weren't anticipated back in 1797 when we started this experiment. Things are super different now. And I think that we can identify, even though we have a unitary license, everyone's a lawyer, we can identify that people are in very different types and streams of practice. And so maybe there are like other considerations that we need to bring to bear as to how people end up at convocation and where they come from and how they're selected. I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly think it's a discussion worth having. Do I think that the 20 inside and 20 outside and 40 overall is necessarily the answer to our modern problems? I don't. I think it's just what we're stuck with. And there may be need for some legislative amendments if we ask super nicely and come up with a really thoughtful plan for reform in the future. But that's going to require that we elect the right people to show that leadership.
Now, last couple of questions here, Doug. I guess for many of my students that are listening, and again, you've provided a nice overview of FOLA. Anything more there about you'd like to say about your organization? As well as probably hopefully still some lawyers listening now, still after the election, but about the merits of your local law associations, the libraries, FOLA itself, and any other events and resources that would be of benefit to both students and licensees that may be tuning in.
I would commend anyone to become a member of their county and district law association. Our library staff, set aside the lawyers for a second, our library staff across the province are excellent. And I routinely hear stories about law associations offering sort of a couple times a year orientation sessions for new lawyers or lawyers who just moved to that community to come in and be oriented to the library and see how to access the resources and see what they have available. And that it's just been an invaluable support for their practice right at the front end of joining a local bar. So I commend anyone to do that. Law associations are also great sources of mentorship. It provides you with a network of people in your community who can assist you when you are encountering something new in your practice. I'm still a fairly new lawyer, but I routinely encounter stuff in my area of practice, which is now fairly well defined, where I'm to call someone to find out what do I do or what should I be thinking about. Law associations provide you with another way to do that. And I think the last thing is that a lot of people, especially younger lawyers today, I think have joined the legal profession, have sought out a legal education because they believe in some form of advocacy or activism outside of like client-based advocacy. And so law associations can provide you with a toehold to engage in that type of work in the community on justice issues. We're a really important player in the legal community in a lot of parts of Ontario. Your law association can speak out on issues facing your local courts or other access to justice needs in the community. And so it's a way to be a part of that important work. And I tell young lawyers and I tell law students that one of the first things you should do if you are joining the bar in especially outside of the GTA where there aren't as many other resources is go to your local courthouse library, introduce yourself, and consider becoming a member because you will not regret it.
And I guess the last question kind of just directly related to that. Any words of wisdom, any advice for students, paralegal students, law students, newly licensed, or people going through the process as they look to jump into this profession?
Well, I would say that one thing I have learned is that there is no one right way to be a lawyer. And I think that it's easy to forget that at the beginning. It's easy to forget that in law school. We all sort of get admitted based on the things we did before that made us good candidates. But once we're there, we try to all be the same type of perfect person. And I think we quickly discover that we can't do that. The same thing is true in practice. You will meet, a million lawyers who will practice in a million different ways, and none of them are necessarily wrong or bad. They're just different. I think you have to adopt the styles and techniques and professional manner that works for you. Now, I'm not saying not to observe the rules of professional conduct or anything like that. I'm just saying that, I think that coming out on my own and working in a few different environments, like leaving big law, I've done a bit of work with some Indigenous organizations. I've done a bit of per diem work with the Crown's office. It's opened my eyes to how different people practice in different types of firms, not even just the firms I've been part of, like the different types of organizations that I've corresponded with. And so I would really, encourage new calls, younger lawyers, paralegals entering their practice, that there is no one right way to do this, and to not be discouraged by finding others are doing things or taking a different approach to their work.
Perfect. So Doug, thanks so much for taking the time and speaking with us today. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. Take care, everyone.